on the pillow. None of them moved, and the only sounds they made were the faint wheezes and sighs of their breathing. Then the stifled cry came again, and the lump that was Tommy moved. It seemed to swell and swarm with bumps that must be knees or elbows, but that didn't look right. Sam didn't move. Part of his mind noticed that the lights were fluttering in the second bathroom, too. Tommy's blankets humped and shook, and it occurred to Sam that maybe there were two people in the bed. Maybe there was some British boys' school-style hanky-panky going on. But then the mound deflated, and he could see it was only Tommy, tangled alone in his blanket, lying on his back. One side of the boy's face was drawn up, as if a string was pulling a corner of his mouth toward his ear, and as Sam stood, still unable to move, Tommy's body twisted and convulsed. The whole bed shook with the force of it. Sam's paralysis broke, and he stepped quickly toward the bed, but before he could reach it, Tommy's body went slack. He stopped again, confused. Tommy now lay fast asleep, or unconscious, motionless but for the shallow pumping of his chest. For the first time, Sam noticed that the other boys weren't asleep. How could they be with the awful noises Tommy made? But were lying immobile in some kind of semi-conscious paralysis. David Blanco, in the bed next to Tommy's, lay with his eyes slightly open, just glistening pale slits. In the deeper shadow at the far end of the room, Jim Waneka was sitting up, rigid, motionless. Sam almost called to him, but then realized his eyes weren't really open either, just unseeing slits like someone anesthetized or dead. Tommy's chest and stomach and legs began rising and falling, rippling in a series of convulsions. At first, the movements were gentle and rhythmic, as ripples undulating in a pond, but they quickly grew faster and more vehement until it looked as if the scrawny body would wrench itself apart. The sheer violence of the movement seemed to knock Sam another step backward. He felt torn between wanting to run and duty to his charges, between terror and a hideous fascination. This wasn't right, he knew. This wasn't natural. Nothing he'd encountered in the army or as an orderly in the crisis ward in Phoenix had prepared him for this. Abruptly, he became aware of the great dark sagebrush plains all around the building, the infinite night sky above hundreds of thousands of square miles of bare, red-brown earth, stark rocks, lonely mesas, and shadowed canyons. He remembered the feeling from his childhood, from the times he'd been herding his family's sheep in the evening as the stars pricked through one by one, and the sun bleached only the very western edge of night, and he could feel in the lonely empty hollow of his gut just how big and incomprehensible the world was. He'd almost forgotten. Now he realized, with a sense of calamity, that the world he'd disciplined himself to accept, that he'd spent his adult life buying into and working to master, wasn't real after all. The world of white America, and science and school, jobs and sports and TVs didn't have an explanation for this. This was something come out of the world's hidden places, from the old world of the Bible or his grandfather's stories, or the dark legends of witches and ghosts that had been whispered from person to person long before human beings knew how to write them down. Tommy made a quiet, awful sound, as if a full-bellied scream had been throttled by a throat too constricted to allow it to pass. Sam bolted forward, but just as he caught the arching shoulders, the awful tension went out of the boy. One moment, Tommy's right arm had started to push forward, and then Sam felt something like a shock through his hands and arms, a vortex of sensation that buzzed quickly through his stomach, and the boy's arm snapped back and lay limp on his chest. All Sam held in his arms was a slack, sleeping 15-year-old. Sam felt only an instant of relief as he lowered Tommy back to the pillow. His movements felt as if they were resisted by a powerful force, some warped gravity, or a form of magnetism that influenced flesh and bone. The light bleeding in from the corridor was really going crazy now. It strobed as if a string of flashbulbs was going off in the bathroom as Tommy began to shudder and twitch and another wave of convulsions took him. Julietta McCarty stared across her desk and tried to assimilate what Sam had just told her. He insisted that there was no other way to look at it. It wasn't a prank, or even an ordinary seizure. Some kind of disturbance or force radiated from the Kide boy. The other boys had lain or sat unmoving throughout his battle with Tommy, despite the awful noises he'd made and the thrashing and wrestling. Sam had felt it himself. Now Tommy was in the infirmary, Sam said, doing that thing again like last time, and the nurse had called Dr. Tsosi. As an afterthought, Sam informed her that he was quitting, effective immediately. He didn't have to explain why. Sam was 40 years old, a reliable staffer who had served in the Army, where he'd been trained as a paramedic, and he'd earned a bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Arizona. Though he'd been born on the reservation, he'd lived a good part of his life elsewhere, but like most Navajos of his generation, he hung uncertainly between the old beliefs and the view of the world he'd absorbed from white America. In Julietta's experience, even the most culturally assimilated Navajo believed that some truth lay beneath the traditional fears of skinwalkers, Navajo wolves, spirits of the dead, and the consequences of violating old taboos. "Sam, you know I'll never be able to replace you." Julietta tried to keep the pleading out of her voice. "I've had 6 hours to think about it. I talked to my wife. It scares her for me to be here anymore." He knew what his leaving meant, and was clearly feeling bad about his decision, but he left her office with a resolute stride. Only 8:15 in the morning, and she was already confronted with 2 pieces of very bad news. It was bad enough that she'd just lost a linchpin of her residential staff, a man both she and the students admired. But equally disturbing, no, worse, a sick, strangling fear that clotted in her chest, was that Tommy Kide had been back only 2 days and already his troubles had resumed. Why Tommy, of all of them? The first time his bizarre symptoms had cropped up, they had passed quickly, and she and Dr. Tsosi had decided to let it go as some flu symptom, maybe, or a touch of food poisoning. But the second time the attack had lingered and intensified, and Dr. Tsosi had referred Tommy for an exhaustive diagnostic workup at the Indian hospital. The problem was that the symptoms had passed before they'd even completed the hour-long drive to Gallup, and after 4 days of testing that had included CT scans, electroencephalograms, comprehensive blood work, and a battery of psychological tests, the doctors had given Tommy a clean bill of health. He'd shown no cranial abnormalities, no detectable seizure activity, no sign of any illegal drugs in his system. In fact, he'd showed no symptoms of physical illness at all. "Probably just dehydration," one smug intern had told her. "Sometimes its effects can mimic seizure activity. It's only temporary. Make sure he drinks lots of Gatorade." Remembering his condescension infuriated Julietta, as if a lifelong resident of the area and principal of a boarding school wouldn't know the effects of the hot, dry climate of western New Mexico on teenagers, and she mastered her anger with the hard pragmatism her position required of her. She had to think clearly, couldn't let her emotions get in the way. That Tommy's symptoms had returned meant that he was a child seriously at risk. But how? The hospital couldn't find anything wrong with him. And what was she to make of Sam's claim that the disturbance had affected the other boys? 2 lights on her phone had begun blinking demandingly, and abruptly she realized she couldn't be bothered with whatever it was. She needed to get away from distractions and think this through. She left her desk, stopped briefly to tell the secretary that she was going for a walk, and hurried out of the administration building. Outside it was a perfect mid-September day. The strong north winds that had battered the school last night had died out. The sun was halfway up the eastern sky, its heat already a smart slap on her face, even though a layer of cool air still hovered above the ground. Arms crossed, chin on her chest, she scuffed across the rear access road to the partial shade of a trellis she'd had set up as a place for staff to take